Welcome back to episode 9 of the Theo Jaffe Podcast. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing one of my favorite podcasters, the one and only Dwarkesh Patel. Dwarkesh is, in many ways, what I aspire to be as a podcaster. He interviews some of the most interesting people in the world in AI, history, economics, and beyond, from Ilya Sutskever to Tyler Cowen, and does so only after many hours of deep research and crafting some of the most thought-provoking questions I've ever heard. His listeners include Jeff Bezos, Paul Graham, and Nat Friedman. In this episode, we cover a wide range of topics: how to prepare for and produce great podcasts, different visions for both the short-term and long-term future of AI, how to get talent into politics, and much more. This is the Theo Jaffe Podcast. Thank you for listening, and now here's Dwarkesh Patel. Hi, welcome back to episode 9 of the Theo Jaffe Podcast, here today with Dwarkesh Patel.
Hey, what's up, man? Wait, what was the thing I was supposed to say? Thanks for having me on. You can keep this.
Whatever you want.
Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start off by talking about, the events of the last weekend, because when I scheduled this, I did not know that that was going to happen. I don't think anybody knew that that was going to happen. So with all the Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson reading that you've done, reading about power, reading about human behavior, do you think you could have predicted or understood anything about this better?
Certainly not predicted, because I think the prediction is contingent on a whole bunch of details about what happened that I still am not aware of, and I don't think almost anybody's aware of, despite the endless speculation that's been going on. As for, does it better help you understand it? Certainly. I was just thinking about the Lyndon Johnson books are good, but there's also, Caro has this great biography of Robert Moses, the famous the dictator of New York City, and he has many episodes, Robert Moses, in his early career where there's an indication that he might be doing something that's in his own self-interest, or that doesn't actually accord with his very, very publicly flattering image. And it just kind of brushed under the rug, not well understood. People don't talk about it or gossip about it because of different kinds of fears. Anyways, I'm not saying that that's necessarily what's happening, but it is important to understand that we don't have the full picture yet, and keep that in mind.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, just before I got on the podcast, I was scrolling through X, Twitter, as one does, and I read that, there's a new piece of information after all this, that they were working on like an agent that can do math. It's pretty interesting. So you interviewed Ilya Sutskever on the podcast before. Did you judge his character at all? Did he seem to you like totally earnest, like with the goal of protecting humanity?
Yeah, honestly, that's a sort of that's the kind of thing it's hard to evaluate somebody on from a 1 hour conversation. And I wouldn't base it just on that, but from the testimonials of the people who know him, it really does seem like he's a very genuine guy who has this priority as making sure humanity has a good future. And that's not to say that he can't make mistakes in his judgment about how to get to that future, but I think nobody's contradicting that basic motivation of his from people who know him over the years.
I'm pretty surprised that he switched sides. This whole thing was very hard to follow.
Yeah, I just think like there's a lot we don't know. It's like even hard to comment. But there's so much we don't know, and it's really hard to say why he switched sides.
Yeah. So switching subjects a little, like basically a lot of what you do is reading and research. So like, how do you read specifically? Like, do you take notes? Like, how does your note-taking methods work? If you do take notes?
I recently, after I talked to Andy Matuszak, I started using spaced repetition myself, and it's insane how much more effective it is. And you realize it when you make a card about something you think it's not even important, like, or not that it's not important. You make a card about something where you think, oh, obviously I'm going to remember this, but you're like, I might as well make a card about this. And then a week later, you've almost forgotten, and you see the card, and you're like, well, what's that again? Anyways, this is to say that again and again, I've seen the evidence actually that the spaced repetition. At this point, I've gotten to the point, honestly, where if I'm not making cards about something I'm reading, I might as well, not even read it at all. That's how much less effective I think normal reading is. As for note taking itself, I don't really do much of that. I mean, I just have a Google Doc, as in guest name questions, and I start adding questions to it. And before the interview, I'll organize them. But yeah, spaced repetition and coming up with just like noting down questions as I'm reading.
What specifically, like, what do you use for spaced repetition? Anki?
No, I use this app called Mochi. It's just a nicer interface.
Hmm. Yeah, I've tried using Anki before for language learning, and it seems like it might be good for language learning, but for actually just like general learning and knowledge, like, do you know of any really successful people who have used spaced repetition to learn more effectively than just, reading huge volume?
Yeah. Depends on what you mean by successful. Let me see. I think it's just not a technique that's been. Didn't it start with Maimonides or something? I don't know the ancient history of this, but I'm guessing there's been people who have used something that, that was similar to spaced repetition. I actually just remembered. I was recently reading the Gulag Archipelago, and there's this really interesting chapter on memory. And Solzhenitsyn, by the way, the Gulag Archipelago, of course, is the famous book about the Soviet prison labor system. And Solzhenitsyn talks about how basically people who like him who are composing these long books. I mean, he composed the Gulag Archipelago in his mind, the multi-volume work, and he just kind of memorized it, and how he had these beads that were nominally to pray for. And his memorization technique was that he would go bead by bead, and at every bead, he would make sure he has remembered the passage that he has written down in his head, and he would recite it, and then he'd go to the next beat and so on. And that's how he memorized the work he composed in his head, because he couldn't write it down, otherwise you'd get executed for your thoughts. That was sort of a tangent on is there anybody who's successfully employed it? I think it is true that a lot of really, I mean, so for lack of a better term, people who are really sample efficient. You can just like absorb a lot of information and synthesize it to come up with new ideas. People like Tyler Cowen or Bern Hobart. They seem to do fine without spaced repetition. I personally, I have benefited tremendously from its use, and I wonder if they themselves would benefit as well. I should ask them. Yeah, I should ask Bern or something.
Yeah, I think that would be good. So your moat, I guess you'd say, is deep research and good questions. So do you think that there's any kind of trade-off between deep research and good questions and popularity? Like, does going too deep exclude some people?
Certainly at some frontier. Certainly there's like eventually there'd be a trade-off, right? Like 7 billion people are not going to be following a conversation about that's like insufficient depth. But I do think I'm at least an order of magnitude away from that frontier, in that I could like still go 10x more, and I'd have an audience that's big enough. There's enough people who would want a conversation of this depth. And I used to think this way before. When my podcast was much smaller, I used to think, oh, well, it's, because people, a larger group of people couldn't appreciate this kind of stuff. And since then, it's grown a lot, and people do appreciate it. And I've realized it was just cope. And so it's just like not useful to think in that way. You do something really high quality. And if you were to have a super banal podcast, then who's going to listen to it? Like, there's already a bunch of them out there, and for different reasons, they're already up at the top. You're not going to be able to compete with them on that niche.
What kind of
don't you think? What do you think? I mean, you're making a podcast. What do you think about that?
I mean, honestly, yeah, there's a long way to go with. I mean, I don't really worry about getting too popular at this stage. I worry more about the opposite. Like, how do I get more popular? And I mean, yeah, I was talking about this with my friends recently, a couple months ago. They were like, oh, you should lean more into like make like sensationalist thumbnails and titles and YouTube shorts with I see some podcasts popularized in this way, where you have like a GTA race in the background behind the people talking. And like, do I want to do that? Like, will it dilute the brand that I want to create? Or like, is that just the way that you get people on the podcast? And if so, like, will it get the people who I want to be listening to the podcast, who will, listen to it for a while and share it? Lots of great things to think about.
Yeah, I certainly think, especially for the kind of content you're making, it's like the kind of, I mean, yeah, it's it's hard to imagine that that's the way it gets popular. At the same time, it's not something to neglect. So there's a difference between doing the most cringy shit possible versus neglecting it altogether. Um, I certainly put like a lot of care into making my thumbnails, and then I've started making a lot of Twitter clips. Sometimes they go viral. But it's just not cringy shit like, yeah, the GTA races in the background. But yeah, like promotion is good. It's like nothing against promotion. There's a separate question of then you don't avoid the deep research, and you still promote, but you do it in a way that is true to the authentic thing you're trying to put out there.
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, certainly there's a lot of podcasts that are just like content. I was thinking about this earlier today. Like, what makes something good is that it can no longer be called content. Like, I would call a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the stuff that I see on social media content, but I would
Yeah.
not call like Paul Graham's essays content because there's something
Mm.
more than that.
Yeah. Definitely. Or what is the other one where I think people try to define like how would I define your profession, and they say like, are you a content creator? And I cringe a little bit on the inside, but
Mhm.
it's worse to be called the alternative, which is journalist. So I take what I can get.
What about citizen
Um,
journalist?
yeah, I don't know. It just like it's not journalism exactly. It's not current events or anything like that. Um, Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it. I think because content implies something that can be farmed, content farming, or that is fungible with other kinds of content, and you do want to be something that's not just like that.
Yeah. So going back to the clips, what makes you decide which parts of the podcast to make into clips to post on Twitter? Is it like just interestingness? Is it like um conciseness? Something else?
I,
All of them?
actually, I'm literally probably tomorrow going to put out a contest to make clips for my podcast because it takes so much time and so much context and so much taste to do it. Um, I mean, it just you can put out a certain clip and it'll get like, I don't know, 10, 20 likes on Twitter, and you can put out a different thing and it'll get 3,000 likes. And it's just about the context of knowing which part to clip that people will be enthused to share and so on. And that's honestly a pretty challenging thing that I haven't been able to automate away yet, or forget about automating. I haven't been able to hire away yet. So yeah, I'm just going to do a contest to see if else can do it, because it's been super important to the growth of the podcast, but it's also taken away a ton of time that I should be spending reading.
What do you think they will choose for what to make into clips?
It's hard to even explain. I mean, I was trying to come up with an explanation for the description of this contest and of guidelines, and it can be something that you could say, oh, it should be about hot button issues so that it goes viral, but it's not that. Maybe it should touch on something people are interested in it. Um, but there's an element of novelty about something people care about. So I had, I'm just trying to think back on certain clips that went viral. I had a clip about Shane like explaining that search is important to add into these LLMs to get them to do novel things. Now that's not about like a hot button issue like cultural wars or anything, but it is interesting. And you can always explain for each one. It's like the Anna Karenina quote of every happy family is happy in the same way, and all unhappy families are unhappy in a different way. Um, I guess all clips that go viral are unique in their own way. At least I don't know. Maybe that's not true for the average podcast, but that's what I found for the ones I've tried to analyze of mine. I don't know how much the audience. I think it'll be. Definitely, you and I are very interested in how these clips are manufactured. It's challenging. I wonder how much the audience is interested in the clip making.
Well, the audience is interested in the clips. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's the point. We're trying to optimize for the audience. So like
Yeah,
have you studied Mr. Beast or any other like super viral people, or is what you try to do just different?
yeah. It's hard to. I don't think there's much to generalize from the Mr. Beast type stuff. I admire what he's able to do for his own kind of content. It just you just can't advertise that content the same way that we advertise ours.
What about like specific podcasters in this niche, like Lex Friedman? Although Lex doesn't seem to do that much. Um,
He has a clips channel. I think that helps him out probably.
yeah, I
I think he
imagine.
just kind of farmed it. Yeah.
I think the only time I actually watch video podcasts is the Lex clips.
Yeah.
Otherwise, well, speaking of watching different media, going back to talking about you reading, do you typically read mostly books or articles, or do you watch YouTube videos or podcasts or all the above? Like what's the split there?
I actually don't listen to many podcasts at all, if any. There's not really maybe a handful. I can't really think of any podcasts I listen to that regularly. Um, I do read a lot of books, obviously, and part of it is what drives my interest. Part of it is the books of the guest I'm interviewing. Because I've been getting a lot into AI recently, there's a lot of papers and technical material, some textbooks. It just depends on the subject.
Hmm. What
Like
about
I can definitely talk about like for a particular, if you want me to, I can go into what might have happened on like a typical episode if I'm interviewing Dario or Ilya or something.
yeah, sure.
Um, Let me think back on which would be a good episode. So, yeah, so for Dario, I read all the papers that they put out on the transformer circuits thread of different mechanistic interpretability things. Then just reading a bunch of stuff about scaling, the original scaling laws papers, how that's evolved over time, talking to a bunch of researchers, AI researchers to better understand the field and what's uncertain about it that would be interesting to ask about, better understand the mechanistic interpretability results and what they imply. Yeah, that kind of stuff.
How do you get people like Dario in particular, who are seem to be very media shy on the
Mm.
podcast? Is it just cold emails?
Eventually you build up a reputation and then you know somebody who's linked to them, which is what happened there. Yeah, basically just not necessarily cold emails, but you just like you get to meet more people over time, and it's not something I would try to do consciously, but it's just been helpful, and that's what's gotten me some of the big guests.
Hmm. Do you think that you're like naturally good at podcasting, or more that you like got good over time? And if
I
so,
definitely have gotten much better over time. Like I haven't even tried to listen to one of my old conversations because if I tried, I think I'd cringe really hard.
what changed?
Um, I just learned more, and you can notice this about if I listen to podcasts I don't like. I notice the same thing that same patterns that I saw in my old podcast, which is very generic questions because you just don't know much about anything. So you just have to ask these sort of vacuous, general questions. Um, yeah, I've just learned more things. I've I can better empathize with the audience. Um, and as I've gotten older, I think that's not an insignificant part of this. I started the podcast when I was 19. I'm 23 now. It's
I'm
like
19.
your brain has probably changed in that time.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Was it like a conscious effort or just kind of like just getting older and smarter? Was there any
Yeah, I
conscious
mean,
effort?
definitely the learning things was for years I've been preparing to interview guests from a wide variety of fields. And so I've been reading a shit ton of shit during that time. And that's definitely been a big part of it.
But there's no specific thought like, oh, I need to make my questions better. And here's like the dimensions on which I can make the questions better. It's just like, add more to the pre-training data.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, yeah. That's a great way
Hmm.
to phrase it.
Yeah, interesting. Because like a lot of progress in AI is just getting more data and better data.
Yeah. And I actually heard a really interesting analogy to here to learning in general. You can think of when you're getting into a new field, you just want to pre-train on a whole bunch of random tokens. You just read the papers, the textbooks. Um, you're just trying to grok, and then afterwards you do this fine-tuned supervised fine-tuned learning where you just like really delve deep into what every passage means once you better understand what's going on generally in the field.
Hmm. Like the Noah Smith two papers thing.
What is that?
Basically, Noah Smith said something like, if you want to introduce me to a new field of literature, like give me two papers from that literature, and that's like a good test because if the literature doesn't have two papers, then or if the literature doesn't have two good papers, then the rest of it's not worth reading. And like if the papers themselves are like really insightful, then there's probably something there.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot the rest of it, but that's kind of the
Yeah.
basics.
Get it is definitely about how that's probably a good tip on how to evaluate the literature to begin with.
Mhm. So, if you didn't consciously refine much in the past, have you thought about what to consciously refine for the podcast in the future?
I have thought about ways to promote it. Um, as for the basic format that I usually do of interviews, I actually haven't, and I think people can give me feedback that I should probably take to heart. But yeah, there's not something that I think. Oh, there is one thing. But this is not about learning more or something. It's just making sure that I actually ask about the most important thing and I don't let that go, because I used to have this habit and may still do, just bouncing around from archaic topic and esoteric thing I read in their book to esoteric thing I read in their book, and not just honing in on the most important thing and making sure we spend a good 20 minutes on it.
Hmm. So, what do you think the most important thing would be if someone were to interview you? Is this
I
question
think I'm
cheating?
different in the sense that like I don't have like a big take, and that we're I guess we could talk about AI. I mean, I've had to think about that in order to do different interviews. But honestly, even there, I don't really have like an original take. I just have a different small sort of takes and heuristics about a lot of different kinds of things. Um, yeah, but for me, I think people seem to think I know more about, like, I have all these kinds of heuristics about podcasting that I don't. Like, so when people ask me like, what are your tips for podcasting? I don't know. Just like I try to read it and I just try to come up with
Just
good questions.
do
Whereas
everything
like
in
the
the link.
object level things are the things that are definitely very interesting to me, but the topics themselves.
So, yeah, you mentioned something about people were giving you feedback on like the format of the podcast. Have you thought about monologues? Two of the relatively few podcasts that I listen to, I wouldn't say I listen to very few, but relatively few, are Hardcore History by Dan Carlin and the
Mm.
Founders Podcast by David Senra, which are both monologues, like always. And I find them to be really, really interesting, even though I typically listen, or even though I typically prefer to read blog posts.
Mm. No, I think that's a great point. And the great thing about, for example, hardcore history is that it is an audiobook in some sense, because it's like 12 hours of content on a topic. That's an audiobook. But he narrates it conversationally. He's just talking to you. And so the speech patterns and the redundancies that make speech easy to understand come about naturally. And so, yeah, I love that. Maybe I should do that. So next time I write a blog post, maybe I should just do a related monologue, not just narrating the blog post, but just kind of shooting the shit about it. There's something I thought about before. Would you find that interesting?
Yeah, I would.
Okay, yeah, I'll try that out on the next one.
Yeah, so I wonder if the monologue podcast grabs the human attention more than an audiobook of reading something that's meant to be read and not
Yeah,
listened to.
exactly, exactly. Yeah. There's
So
definitely a different sort of cadence to speech than to writing, and then just like the conversational nature of these kinds of podcasts gets at that better.
we're talking about different blog posts that you've done. So uh, you've deleted some of your old podcast episodes and articles. So
Yeah.
why did you? Was it just not meeting the quality bar? Like what would it have taken to keep them up?
Yeah, exactly. It just wasn't that good. I mean, again, like I started the podcast and blog when I was like 19 years old. So it's not that surprising that I look back on it and then cringe at the low quality of some of it, which is not anything against my past self. I'm very grateful for what my past self has done, but just certain things, I'm just wasn't like the best work I produced, so I just kind of took it down.
I like the Contra David Deutsch on Universal Explainers one.
Yeah, did I take it down?
I think so.
Oh shit, I should put that on. That was actually yeah, I fondly remember that one, so that's surprising I took it down.
Yeah, and definitely the Contra Marc Andreessen on AI risk one. That one I really liked.
No.
Although you didn't take that down.
Yeah.
Were you
Yeah, no, I
surprised
like that
by
one.
were you surprised by his reaction? How he blocked?
Yeah. Yeah. And then people pointed out to me afterwards, well, maybe I should have emailed him privately beforehand to let him know. I don't know what that would have changed. Um, I mean, I guess fair enough. I think still doesn't. The main thing is not even like the personal reaction. I really don't care about that. I just hope he considers the arguments against his position. And I don't know if he has.
Hmm. I mean, I'm sure that he's certainly seen the arguments against his position, but do you think that's a little bit bearish if someone as prominent and famous and clearly intelligent as Marc Andreessen does not seem to be able to engage with counter arguments?
I don't think he has an obligation to like write a counter argument to me again, right? I think he's a busy guy. He has an open invite to come back on the podcast. He was on it before to talk about AI and these related topics. I don't know if you'll take me up on it now. But yeah, no, I think if you're gonna play in the intellectual arena, you gotta if somebody, as far as I know, I'm the only person who actually went through the effort to do a point by point rebuttal of that blog post, and in a way that went really viral itself. So I think if something reaches that stature and has that kind of effort and quality behind it, I think you're obligated to respond.
Hmm. That was one of my favorite episodes, actually, the Marc Andreessen one. Like, I did
Yeah.
not know that Kerry used to refer to like whaling operations.
Oh yeah. No, he's a really smart guy. He's super interesting. Has a really interesting takes about all kinds of things. I just think here he's got some bad arguments. And maybe I wouldn't say like uh, I, I think you're going to put ideas out there. It just like yeah, he has an open platform at least to come address them on my podcast.
Hmm. So, how do you think AI specifically will affect the future of podcasting? Like, what would happen if it becomes superhuman at interviewing or researching or being interviewed? Like, I just saw a tweet yesterday. It was like a meme about AGI booking a slot on the Dwarkesh podcast.
Yeah. I saw that too. Well, did getting interviewed or doing the interviewing?
Either. Just what do you think will happen to like your career as AI becomes more powerful?
Oh, I think that'll be the least of our concerns. At the point at which it can automate away a podcast, I think it'll be the least of our concerns. Um, no, I think I don't expect to be one of the first jobs to go. I think it just seems like a pretty subtle art, not only to ask the questions, but then to have the human presence and to be able to respond to with follow-ups to what the guest says. I think I'm not expecting to get automated anytime soon.
Well, assuming AGI goes well, because you said it would be the
Yeah.
least of our concerns. And so, we live in this wonderful utopian AI future. Would you still podcast? Like how do you think podcasting would change?
Um, Yeah, it's a good question. Like, well, I honestly think just general, like, what do we want the post AGI world to look like is a under theorized question. And I've asked it to basically all my AI guests, and none of them have given me a good answer. And then part of that is, well, what are you doing personally? I mean, I think personally, I would like to become an enhanced god or something that's traveling around the galaxy with the help of the technology that's the AI's given me, and not just going to be a podcaster forever, hopefully.
Well, traveling around the galaxy in reality or virtually? Because one of my first guests, Greg Fodor, G Fodor, he likes to talk about this idea of subterranean aliens. So, like, what if the real aliens, what if the solution to the Fermi paradox is just that all the aliens go underground in pods under the crust to protect themselves and go live in VR and do whatever they want in VR? Like, why would they travel around the galaxy? If your ship gets blown up, then you actually die. Whereas you could just send a robot that you control from your VR pod underground.
Yeah, I think that makes sense if we're assuming they're biological entities. But I kind of price in already that they are the software that's running in the drones. Like eventually a civilization will just have software. Um, and that's what I mean when I say that I would be enhanced. Like I imagine you'd be an emulation or something. Yeah.
So if you think about AI so much and the future and technology, like, do you discount the importance of space exploration, for example? Like a lot of people think of SpaceX and not OpenAI as like the most transformative company.
Well, it'd be interesting to see if they kind of merge and link together, not merge, like not the companies themselves merge, but if those technologies merge in some way. You can imagine, I don't know, some sort of like GPU run in space or something. That's a little more far-fetched, but um, the development of AI will be super hardware contingent. I mean, we're going to be seeing like if the compute centric framework is correct, we're going to see, $50 billion training runs or $100 billion training runs or something. And all kinds of different hardware is going to be relevant to that. I don't think they're going to be unlinked at the point in which you're developing the AGI.
If you did book the AGI on the Dwarkesh podcast, what would you talk to it about?
I'd be super curious about its psychology. Does it think in the same concepts that we think in? There's the obvious stuff of what are its values, but how different is even the basic cognition and the thought process? Or is it the case that because it learned to think in human language, that it adopted the same mind that language has been developed on, which is our human mind?
Or would it just not know? Kind of how we don't really know how the brain works?
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. And I should probably read more cognitive science to better understand even how the human thinking works. I think that's also another big possibility. I guess we'll have better insight into its mind than we have in our own, because of if the mechanistic interpretability and all these other kinds of research work out. And so we might not even have to ask it. We can just look directly. What are the things I'd be curious about? Just a bunch of stuff relevant to how it's thinking. Presumably it's thinking at a different speed. Presumably it's another thing is I'd be curious about how it communicates with other AIs. Are they communicating in language, or can they just share that latent space? There'd be so many different questions. Do I have any? But it wouldn't be about their opinions or something, or other than the fact that I care about their values. I'd just be super curious about how they work and how much is available to them to divulge about how they work. Maybe they don't understand themselves, but
maybe they'll be prevented from understanding themselves too well.
Yeah.
I don't think OpenAI will give them access to the weights.
Yeah. But we don't have our own weights, and I guess you could say that we don't understand ourselves as a result. But I don't know. I feel like you could probably learn a lot just from introspection.
Are you more optimistic about AI alignment, given that we can't access our own weights, and yet we seem to be fairly aligned, and we can access the weights of the AIs? I talked to a few people on my podcast, Nora Belrose, Quentin Pope, and on Twitter, Tior Taxes, who seem to be like much more optimistic about alignment for that reason.
Yeah, so there is definitely not only that we can read their minds, but here's something we can't do with humans. If you commit a crime, we kill you off, and then we kill off all your descendants so that the genes which cause your crime are diminished in the gene pool.
They
which
do
is
that in
kind
China.
of what we're doing. I guess you kind of, but you like society, you're saying we just send you off to prison. I don't think it has that much of a sort of genetic effect, that whereas with AIs, we literally, with gradient descent, we can sort of like not only read their mind, but like actually change their mind in a sort of very fine-grained way. So yeah, in those two ways, it definitely does suggest that it might be easier. The main difficulty, of course, being that the starting point is not something that is just genetically very similar to us, but is totally alien. Just starts off on a different trajectory than evolution. And you know what I mean? Like humans already have this sort of inbuilt machinery that's quite similar to each other.
Well, do you think it's just totally alien? Like Rune has tweeted a lot about how, he used to think that AIs, LLMs were, alien minds, the Shoggoth from another dimension. And now he thinks that they're characters instantiated from the human prior.
Yeah, but there's an Eliezer rebuttal, which is that because it can pretend to be any human in that particular next work doesn't mean that it itself is the average over all those humans or something. And I just think like we don't really know, or at least I certainly don't know, and we shouldn't just assume the safest or the most comforting possible version. Just like one human, it's just grogging human consciousness. It's just like no human works by being able to predict accurately what any given human might say on the internet. And it might be the case that the end result of this is something that approximates human psychology pretty well in its own intrinsic motivations. It just doesn't seem warranted to assume that will be the case.
Well, Eliezer talks about the actress in the Shoggoth, but what about the rebuttal to that, which is, all it is a next token predictor. And if the next tokens contain goodness and love and peace, then the AI will do goodness and love and peace. And if they contain taking over the world, then the AI will take over the world. And there's no reason to believe that there's actually a Shoggoth inside whose desires will be different from just the distribution of text that it was trained on.
Yeah, and then I will just recapitulate the entire sequences, because then there's the Eliezer response, which is that as the thing gets a smarter, then it will closer and closer approximate something which has goals and intrinsic drives. And yeah, that's kind of the basic shape of the argument.
Do you think that the empirical evidence so far has been friendly to the Eliezer group?
Oh, it depends on which part. Like, it's certainly not on the fast takeoffs. But you got to remember, this guy was writing this shit like 20 years ago, right? Compared to the other people were writing 20 years ago, he certainly is more accurate. Compared to what we know now, it's not. He expected a sort of an intelligence explosion. It looks like we're living in this slow takeoffs world. As for on that particular prediction, what was I think I lost my train of thought, but I'll let you say what you're about to.
We were talking about the Shoggoth. Is there a
Yeah.
Shoggoth inside GPT-4? How has evidence? Do we just
Yeah,
not?
right. So, I mean, one thing we see is that dumber animals don't seem to have any sort of ability to they just kind of respond to the direct, immediate. Like an amoeba will just go towards the light, right? There's not some goal or directive. It just, the next token prediction equivalent for an amoeba, just go towards the light. And as things get smarter, it does seem that there's more of a sense of agency, and maybe agency is required to do really complicated tasks that we will train the AI to do. Why that agency would be something we would always control, it's not self-evident.
So you strike me as somewhat middle of the road centrist on AI risks, not like a full doomer, but not sympathetic to the Marc Andreessen, we're all going to be fine, totally
Yeah.
arguments. Have you gotten like more optimistic or more pessimistic over time? How has your AI risk journey gone?
I think even a year ago, I just wouldn't even have contemplated these things. Or not contemplated, sorry. I just wasn't taking it that seriously. And of course, the AI advances we've seen since have just convinced me that, no, this is real. This is actually going to happen in your lifetime. And then once you actually integrate that into your worldview, then everything just becomes more concrete. So have I become more optimistic or pessimistic? In a sense, more pessimistic than I started off as. In a sense, more optimistic, because originally the sort of assumption was either you just don't think this shit is real or you're a doomer. And then there's a lot of really smart people who are in the middle, as you say, that I've interviewed on the podcast, and they've given me very interesting sort of worldviews that help me better understand their perspective. Carl Schulman, Paul Cristiano, so on.
So going back to some of your guests on the podcast, I love a lot of your podcast guests. I've had a couple of them on my podcast, Razib Khan, Scott Aronson. I've met Bryan Caplan before. I know that you're good friends with him.
Yeah.
One of my friends cold emailed him a couple years ago, just saying like, "Hey, do you want to get lunch? We're also nerds." And not only did he agree, not only did he take us to this kebab place in Fairfax near George Mason, he paid for our food, and he stayed with us for like 2.5 hours and just
That's awesome.
Talked about all kinds of stuff. It was basically an unrecorded podcast.
Yeah, it sounds just like Bryan. He's a great guy.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Bryan Caplan. Bryan, if you're watching this, thanks, and I hope to have him on the podcast soon.
Yeah, you should.
So, like, who of all your guests strikes you as like the most raw intelligent, and why?
Oh, certainly it would be the AI researchers, people like Dario or Ilya. And it just because like it just takes a lot of raw fucking IQ to do that. Yeah, I mean, if that's what we're counting on, and I certainly don't think that's the most important criterion for everything. But on that raw measure, I think maybe those two would be like top contention. And then, but I've like sort of obviously had like extremely smart people who are way smarter than me on a bunch of them. Yeah.
Do you think it's easier? Do you think it's easy for you to gauge how smart people are who are much smarter than you?
Yeah. Yeah, because it's hard to sort of do a bullshit test. I mean, I'm not going to go down the list because basically every person I've had on the podcast is like really, really fucking smart. But
Yeah.
I just realized the last person, one of the last people I've had on who is qualifies is also like Paul Cristiano and Scott Aronson, who we both interviewed. I mean, I have this great story about Scott Aronson where I was taking his class and he explains his results. And he says, it's a very important result. And he says, I almost proved this myself in 1999, but I realized that somebody had beaten me to the punch 6 months earlier. And I thought back on it. It's like, how old would Scott Aronson have been in 1999? He would have been 19 years old, or 18 or something. That's when he did it. Yeah. So maybe Scott Aronson is my answer. It was like pure raw IQ.
I don't know if you pick favorites, but who do you think your favorite guest was? And who do you think, what do you think your favorite episode was? And are they the same? Is there like an overlap there?
Guest. I don't know if this is necessarily my favorite, but this is the first one that comes to mind. I just really enjoyed Carl Schulman. Just because I got introduced to so many new concepts as a result of that episode, from the compute-centric framework for understanding the scaling and rise of AI to a bunch of the specific takeover risks. So I would say that one. Did you listen to it by any chance?
Yeah, I listened to.
Yeah, what'd you think?
I loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carl Schulman is like, yeah, struck me as really, really intelligent. But in a sense, he kind of struck me as like intelligent in the same way as Eliezer, meaning he makes a lot of his own concepts. He doesn't
Yep.
he doesn't just take whatever there is out there um in the prevailing discourse. He makes his own.
Yeah.
What what impressions did you get from Eliezer, by the way? Did you think he was like Carl Schulman or different?
Um, I think that's like a fair way to characterize. I definitely think Carl is like more rigorous as a thinker and much more up to date on current developments, having a better understanding, for example, of like the actual hardware limitations that are current or the weaknesses and advantages of the current architectures and so on. Um, I would put them in slightly different buckets. I do think they're similar in the sense that they're in the sort of actual. So they adopt this. I think one sort of similarity is that they do think that the decision theory stuff is important and matters. There's just a bunch of weird shit about a causal decision theory and things like that, and they think like that actually could affect the course of things. But yeah, the difference being that Carl, I think, is a bit more rigorous.
So, do you think that some of the character assassinations on Eliezer have some substance, like how he's just detached from reality, he doesn't understand what he's talking about, he's not technical, or does he strike you as like maybe this guy maybe this guy is right after all? Because I'm pretty split on that.
I don't think he's right on like the 99% doom. I think he's just way overconfident.
Yeah.
And I think he's also wrong about the fast takeoffs. And I think the sort of evidence shows that he's been wrong about it.
Does it? Or have we just not reached the fast takeoff yet?
It's seeming more and more like there's not a critical point where things just implode, but rather that intelligence is just a sort of gradual scaling thing. And it could be wrong, of course, anything could be wrong, but you just have to update on evidence as you go forward, right? And then the updates seem to be pointing in the direction away from Eliezer. That being said, the most important thing is that I think he's like an endlessly creative and really interesting thinker. And I think you just had to put him in that context of, yeah, he's probably one of the most intellectually generative people of the last 20, 30 years. I've learned a lot from reading him as a teenager and then in college and so on. And yeah, are there things he's wrong about? Yes, of course. I don't understand the visceral hate that people seem to have for him. And I also don't think people are being fair when they dismiss his contributions.
The
And the
visceral
fact that
hate,
he was on this like decades ago, the thing that is like the
yeah.
main thing people are thinking about now, he was like on it decades ago.
The visceral hate, I think, is just like psychological pain avoidance lashing out. Because if they think that like, oh, if Eliezer's right and if I and everyone I love will die, then like, no, I don't want to believe that.
Yeah.
and I'll attack him. I'll defend myself by attacking him.
And then he obviously is not like, I don't mean this in any way to disparage him, but he's not a normal guy, right? So then it just becomes really easy to be like, oh, what a weirdo or something. And I just don't think that's fair or a valid argument.
Yeah, I remember when I was eating lunch with Brian. This was, before ChatGPT, before
Yeah.
the recent boom in AI. We talked about Eliezer Yudkowsky, who I was familiar with, but not, as dialed in as I am now. And he said, like, he had lunch with Eliezer recently, and Eliezer tried to sit there and convince him that the world was going to end. And he was like, that's just silly. I mean, like, could a super intelligent AI, convince me to kill myself? Like, I just don't think that it could do that. And, he obviously does. Um, I wonder if he's updated since then. He has updated on timelines a bit since he lost his bet on whether
That was
GPT-4
super
passed his
interesting.
exam.
I haven't talked to Brian about it, but I'm really curious to see where his head is at now. You should ask him about it when you have him on the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you agree with Tyler Cowen's characterization that podcasts are basically entertainment?
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think back on no, actually, okay. I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, I know how much how I know how little I understand of the fields that I do podcasts on. And then I think back on I read so much in order to be able to ask questions about this field, and I still think I really don't understand it in any meaningful sense. I couldn't like actually do the job, so to speak, right? If I'm interviewing somebody who's a researcher or something. And that reading is titrated then to just the few questions that I get to ask in the 2 hours or whatever, and the responses able to give. So if I personally feel like there's so much about the field that I don't understand, obviously the audience is in a worse position than I am because of the reading I've done, unless they independently happen to know about it. So I definitely don't think it's like a replacement for actual expertise or something. That being said, I mean, I was saying earlier that I haven't listened to that many podcasts recently, but when I was in high school and a teenager and then in college, I learned so much about so many different fields from podcasts. And you could say, well, you get a sort of introductory understanding of many different fields. And yeah, that's true, but that's useful for most people. There are intros; they need intros to everything.
So when you were talking about titrating into a 2-hour episode of AI researchers, when you do your research, is it more like, holy crap, there's so many amazing and interesting questions I could ask these people? Or is it like, there's really like, I need to find great questions? Like, are great questions overabundant or not abundant?
Um, Not abundant, usually. There are some guests where I literally have a list that's literally 20 pages, Google Docs or something, and obviously we can't get through it. Usually it's not that case. Usually I don't have enough good questions, or that I just barely have enough good questions.
Hmm.
Yeah. But what's your experience?
Yeah, my experience, yeah, basically the same.
Mm-hmm.
I vary based on the guest.
Yeah.
How many of your questions, if any, are just off the cuff? Like, do you come up with completely new questions that you hadn't put in the document off the
Yeah,
cuff?
definitely. I mean, the follow-ups, for example, a lot of them are off the cuff. But a lot of the follow-ups are actually questions I was planning on asking later on, but they just naturally follow the sequence of what my guest just recently said.
Do you ever come up with entirely new questions, like not follow-ups, just off the cuff?
Yeah. Yeah. You just they say something and you're like, you come up, you're just like a conversation, right? You would just have questions as somebody's talking. And that's why the research is helpful for the conversation, is so you have enough context to ask those follow-ups.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So during the episode, when you're interviewing someone, what do you think what do you think are the optimal amount of tangents to go into? Like, what's the optimal amount to edit out, if any?
I don't really edit out that much. As for how much, the main constraint is the time of the guest. So you don't want to just talk about things that are not really important or interesting and waste time on that. The optimal, certainly zero is not it. Certainly there's such a thing as going on too many tangents. Yeah, it's hard to say generically. There's certainly not a number that one can give, but you want to go down enough that you can explore interesting directions and new ideas, not so much that you're never getting to the meat of the subject. It should sort of serve the exploration rather than hinder it.
Hmm. So you said you listened to a lot of podcasts back in high school and college. So, like, who are your favorite podcasters and what were your favorite podcasts? And is there
Oh,
total overlap there?
yeah, in high school I would just like listen to a lot of Sam Harris. Just like the normie shit, you know. I think I was into politics when I was in high school, which is obviously a bad idea. It's just a tremendous time sink. Um, and what was the second part of the question? Who are your favorite podcasters? Who are your what?
Yeah. So, favorite podcast, favorite podcasters, and like, were those the same? Are there good podcasts without good podcasters or good podcasters without good podcasts?
Can you give an example of how you can have a good podcaster who doesn't have a podcast?
Well, I mean, the opposite of it. Like I hate to say it, but Lex Friedman, I love his podcast, but I don't think
I
he's a
see.
particularly good interviewer in the
Right.
way that like you or Tyler Cowen are.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's people like that. Who would be a good pod? So that's an interesting question to reverse. Who would be a good podcaster who just has the wrong format and as a result is really fucking it up? There's certainly people you can think of who I wish they had a podcast. Um, Somebody like Christopher Hitchens or something. It would be really cool if he did a podcast. Bern Hobart, he just I guess recently started a podcast, but there's these people who are just super interesting and voluminous thinkers and writers, and they're super great in talking, and they just don't have I keep telling them that you got to make a podcast or something. So I've had former guests on where I think, oh, they would do really good well if they started their own podcast. Sarah Payne was one such figure, just great at extemporaneously speaking and explaining her ideas. But at the time when I was in high school, who were such people? Yeah, it's hard to remember.
Hmm. You think you were just very different back in high school?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's true for everybody, though, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. Do you have any favorite podcast episodes from other podcasters that stand out?
Yeah, I think, for example, I don't really listen to a podcast that much anymore, but not for any reasons of disagreement. But Sammy Harris had a great episode when the BLM stuff was happening, and he had one. Did you listen to this one? I don't know if you were at the time. He just kind of went into the data on police shooting, and I thought that was a pretty brave thing to do, and also super needed and super sense making at the time. And I think like he deserves a great deal of credit for that, and that was a great episode. As for ones that are not like this message needs to go out kinds of things, there's probably a bunch of episodes on Tyler's podcast that I think, looking back on, oh, this is so great. Better help me understand the subject.
Mine would probably be when Tyler Cowen interviewed Paul Graham. That was just like meeting of two great minds who I admire a lot. And they talked about,
Really, I was kind of frustrated because it bounced around from subject to subject enough that like Paul was not prepared to really delve deep into any of them. I think it was really interesting, and I really enjoyed listening to it. But what's your reaction to that sort of taking away of that conversation?
yeah, I mean, there was the meme where Tyler was talking about like the Medici and Paul like hadn't really thought about it. So he was just like, yeah, that's kind of cool, I guess.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah, I mean, Tyler Tyler has Tyler has a unique style that you don't see very often. And I I really like Paul Graham, but I think Paul Graham is best on like lengthier essays
yeah.
where he has had lots and lots and lots of time to think through them. Like his recent one on like I forgot what it was called, but the one that he just came out with. Um I have to look it up because it was one of the best things I've read in the last year. How to Do Great Work. That took him like 6 months just to write this few
Wow.
page long essay. And then, of course,
That,
my other favorite individual episode was probably Lex Friedman interviewing Neil Gershenfeld, who is the director of the Center for Bits and Atoms at MIT. And this was recommended to me by a friend. I didn't find it by myself. And it was all about like self-replicating machines,
huh.
which I had never really
Huh.
thought of.
Yeah, I should listen to that one. That sounds interesting.
Self-replicating machines and just manufacturing in general. He has a class at MIT called How to Build Almost Anything, where
Hmm.
they learn about different kinds of fabrication. His goal is to create like a general fab manufacturing area in the sense that we have like a general purpose computer that can do any
Hmm.
computation.
Yeah, there's definitely I've heard that sort of sentiment or about nanomachines expressed. Drexler has this thing of you can compute anything, and now you need to be able to like program any sort of physical. Uh, yeah, but I should listen to that episode. That sounds interesting.
Hmm. What do you think about Drexler's nanomachines arguments? Have you read his book? And
Yeah, I read his recent one, the Radical Abundance, and now he's working on AI stuff, right? From what I understand. Um,
I haven't heard about that. I know that Eliezer cites his nanosystems book a lot.
or Nanosystems is a different guy, actually. Wait, no, sorry, Nanosystems is Nanomedicine is a different guy. My bad. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm still not sure why it didn't go anywhere. Um, but I really enjoyed Radical Abundance. He has a lot of interesting arguments about the intrinsic efficiency of nanomachines. From what I remember, basically, it was as you miniaturize it, it just becomes a lot more efficient. And you think about how, for example, in your own body, how fast the molecules are moving and how much work they can do. Um, and that's direct physical effect of miniaturization. Um, yeah, but I actually would love to talk to somebody about like why did that not go anywhere. In the book, he has complaints about the funding situation in the 90s where they were supposed to put a bunch of money into nano machines, and then it got co-opted into stuff that was familiar to the old paradigm and wasn't actually advancing the state of the field. But why has it still not gone anywhere? Maybe we should just have something on the podcast to talk about it, because that actually is pretty interesting.
Yeah, maybe he could get Drexler on.
Yeah.
Do you think that has any implications for foom? Like, do you think even if you have a human level AI, even if you don't have like a fast takeoff intelligence explosion, do you think that means an AI would be able to like kill all humans very, very quickly?
Yeah, well, you can certainly nanomachines that can multiply very quickly are possible because we have bacteria. And you can just imagine like how fast can they absorb energy. You can look at algae that multiply and take in photosynthesis, and they can transform the shape of the earth pretty fast. Um, Obviously it has implications because then the question is like how fast could they absorb energy? How fast could they do work? And yeah, but I mean, in the limit, I mean, it probably makes like a few months difference between like whether they had to do with robots versus whether they have to do with nanomachines. But even if the nanomachine stuff doesn't pan out, I think even the robot takeoff is like pretty fast.
Well, do you like to think about PDOOM? Do you think PDOOM is like a useful representation for like how you think about AI risk, or is it just kind of like bullshit numbers made up based on vibes?
Well, I mean, it can be both. It can be a bullshit number that's made up, and it can be useful to have as that. It's useful, I think, to just throw out a bullshit number to gauge your um, credence of any event on. Um, as for, I do understand the criticisms of having such a number. That obviously these are the consequences of human actions with the PDOOM. So you can't, but that's always true of any probability you give, right? It's not just true of PDOOM. So this is then that would be criticisms of giving probabilities of anything, of a war or a probability of somebody winning an election or something. Um, yeah, I think it's like sensible if somebody's like thought about it a lot to have that number.
Do you have a PDUM?
Mine is not that sensible. It just mine literally is a number I kind of pulled out of my ass. I don't know, like 20% or something.
Hmm.
And it just because that's Carl Schulman's, or I don't want to misrepresent him. His might be different, but kind of just like pulling out of people I find credible.
Yeah, 20% seems reasonable. But at the same time, like, do you think that, if for any given century in the future, there's like a 5 to 20% PDUM, like, does that just mean, very, very bad news for civilization, making it another 100,000 years? I remember you talking about this with Tyler.
Yeah, I think the goal is to get to like just transition from this current regime where it is possible to wipe out all of humanity to get to a regime where we like spread out through the stars, where some of us are in like not human anymore, some of us are AIs or gods or some mix or enhanced, and hopefully we can get to an equilibrium where it's just if life is all around the galaxy doing beautiful creative things and it's different kinds of civilizations, it's hard to imagine how you could wipe all of that out. Now, it might just be that the laws of physics prohibit that kind of independence. Warren has this really interesting essay called Colder Wars, where he imagines that it's just really easy to catapult a comet into a planet or solar system and just destroy everything. And so, therefore, there's no it just destruction becomes really easy. That might be the case. I don't know. There might be some physics that makes it super easy to destroy planets and stuff. But hopefully we can get to a situation where just like negligible probability over time. You know what I mean? It just like every year the probability drops, so it asymptotes towards like the cumulative distribute probability is doesn't go to like 100.
Hmm. So going back to social media and your research process, do you scroll through Twitter a lot?
I do. Depends on social media a lot. I think certainly not as much as many people. More than I should, of course.
Well, yeah, it's just so addicting. But who are some of your favorite posters, like POAST? And what do you think makes them
Oh
good?
yeah. Daniel's pretty funny. I like him.
I just got the Daniel follow the other day.
Oh nice.
Finally.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let's see. Um, yeah, it's funny. I don't have any that like regularly make me laugh. And that's my main criterion, because obviously you cannot take posters if you're getting at your actual intellectual opinions from them. It's a from 140 characters at a time. That's a different story. Um,
What about someone like Rune?
yeah, he's great. Yeah, definitely the market has decided obviously that he's a good poster as well. It certainly doesn't need my my endorsement anymore, or ever. Um, but yeah, he's great. I don't know. I haven't ranked my posters. But I'll have to make a tier list with the S, A, B, C, D, and so on.
Yeah, but like if you were to come up with criteria for like what actually makes a poster like Rune good, like would that be similar or different from like what makes a good podcaster?
Yeah, yeah. I think it certainly is a type of skill to be able to make things that are really compelling into 180 characters. There's two things I wouldn't assume. I wouldn't assume that actually correlates to. I have been. I'm not talking about anybody we've named. I'm talking just generically about people. I don't want to name any specific names, but you have somebody who comes up with takes on Twitter, and they have takes about different kinds of topics, and they shoot them out, and then you actually talk to them in real life, and then you talk about a subject that which they shout out a bunch of takes about, and you realize, oh, they understand nothing about this, right? And so it definitely dissuades you of the sort of notion that if somebody has a lot of takes or a lot of viral takes, good posts about a topic, he actually understands it in any way. Um, yeah, I guess I said I had two things, but that's the one thing I have.
Hmm. So you said you spend more time than you should on Twitter. how do you spend your time in general? I remember there's an interview that you did with um another uh website like a couple years ago. Like has it changed since then? Do you have like a daily routine?
I don't remember what I said on there, but I read quite a bit. Um, that's most of my job. So yeah, I spend a lot of time doing that. And there's a lot of logistics involved with the podcast itself, as I'm sure you know, of making
Yeah.
clips and editing and so forth. That takes up a lot of my time. Then a bunch of logistics involved with, reaching out to people and things like that. And that basically sums it up. Um, I exchange ideas back and forth with people, email, group chats, meetings, so forth, meet people who are researchers or understand fields well. And that's about it. A pretty simple existence.
Hmm. With the people you talk to, like, would you say you're like adjacent to the rationalist community?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because like almost all of my guests, I will find eventually that somehow some of them are like rationalist adjacent. Even the ones I didn't really expect, like Razib Khan. When I interviewed him, he told me like, "Oh yeah, actually, I was with Eliezer in like 2008, with lots of people at the original like Singularity Institute and just the Bay Area rationalists, and he
Yeah.
was like an OG there."
Yeah, but it seems like you're pulling people who have some presence on Twitter among the kinds of people you follow. And it's not that surprising that among that group, there'd be a lot of rationalists.
Well, it seems like there's some new factions forming with people who might historically have called themselves rationalists or EAs who now really don't like
Mm.
it, like EACs.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, Although again, it's the same sort of story as Razib, where they like rub shoulders with they just like it's not as totally independent. I have been interviewing historians recently, and there you just have people who would not know if you use the word rationalist what that means. Have just not interacted with the Silicon Valley culture, for better or for worse.
I was looking at an interesting post earlier today that was like a political compass, except
Mm.
instead of the axes being like authoritarian, libertarian, and like left, right, it was AGI will be like the internet versus AGI will be like a million times more important. And then we should accelerate versus we should slow down.
Yeah.
So do you think something like that will become the most important grid on which people align their politics in the near future, or will it kind of just remain the traditional political framework?
I don't think it'll be either of those. I do think if the takeoff, I mean, if the AIs, at some point, if the takeoff stuff is true, then it'll become the most prominent fact about our political life. I don't think there's going to be that much of an appetite. I don't think 25% of the country is going to be agitating for the top right, where you're trying to engineer on the maximum flops out of the solar system. I don't think there's a huge demographic constituency for that. Um, I think the current factions are one a result of certain backlash against EA kind of things, and two a sample of the kind of people who are talking about it right now. What that actually transitions into when it enters a mainstream political system, I think it looks pretty different. And it might be a worse axis on the political system where people try to shoehorn it into current contemporary issues of political correctness or economic equality kinds of things that pale in comparison to the real stakes, which is the fucking galaxy, right?
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, I don't know if the EAC versus EA will be Democrats versus Republicans in like 10 years.
maybe. Do you think that EAC is an interesting or useful philosophy, or is it kind of
Not
just
really.
vibes and trash?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it depends on what you mean by EAC. I don't want to do the same sort of intellectual dishonor that many of them can conduct of completely dismissing ideas without actually trying to um, grapple with them. So it depends what you mean by EAC. It is true that technological growth has been the main force or the betterment of humanity throughout history. It's the kind of thing where you're doing a Mott and Bailey of, well, if that's what you're endorsing, yeah, I'd endorse that as a historical statement. And then then with AI, you have something that's kind of breaking the pattern of the pace of history and the centrality of human beings and so on. So it might be worth considering on its own terms. Um, as for, I don't even know what like the broader EAC take is then of you maximize the. I don't even want to. It's hard to can you like explain what the EAC take is?
Well, first of all, it's kind of funny. Yesterday I was wearing my effective accelerationism t-shirt, which I got
Yeah.
not because I'm an EAC, but just because I think the logo's cool and the general sentiment for everything other than AI is like pretty great. So it
Yeah.
would have been funny if it would have been funny if I was wearing it on the podcast just by chance. Um,
I will say, by the way, it is. I don't necessarily endorse the exact opposite of the EAC claim that slowing down AI is an end in of itself, and I do think people sometimes make a sort of over. Um, they seem to believe in the magical properties of slowing down AI or have unrealistic understanding of how that might be possible.
oh, like
Where
we
the
just
end goal
need
is not
to,
just to have slow AI, the end goal is to align the AI and then point it towards something good, right?
yeah.
The slowing is only a means to an end, and if you're not just going to keep it down forever, right? So the opposite of yak is certainly not a statement I would endorse. I wouldn't endorse like pause AI or something.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed like a marked degradation in the discourse among like rationalist, doomer, decelerationist kind of people over the last few months. Probably just because it's becoming more popular. But yeah, they're now committing many of the sins that the EACs have in their time.
Although you got to remember the real serious people who are concerned about alignment are not posting on Twitter all day. They're like doing technical things at labs or but the kind of people who have the time to be making memes on Twitter are not the best and the brightest.
But what you said about what do EACs actually want to maximize, I watched Beth's talk about like, thermodynamics and the future of everything or whatever. And it was basically like, with thermodynamic dissipative adaptation, what we're trying to do is um, maximize the amount of like free energy in the universe that will like create complexity to best take advantage of it. And like that's what the universe itself did to create life. That's what capitalism does to create great businesses and great business owners. And I think like I don't know how good of an explanation like thermodynamics is for this, but I think the general
Yeah.
sentiment is basically true that like complexity arises out of simplicity and can do pretty great things.
Yeah, but that's true of like a lot of different philosophies that you wouldn't actually endorse the implications of. If you take Marxism, for example, the idea, if you like look at Marx's sort of reading of history, it's that you have a sort of exploiter class that comes up with an ideology to justify their exploitation of either slaves or peasants or something. And before modern economic growth, that kind of was obviously it's a simplification, but that's kind of what like history looked like before that. You did actually just have like serfdom and slavery and shit like that. Um, Maybe that's not directly addressing the point you're making. The more direct to more directly address the point you're making. Um, yeah, it is true that we want like more complexity and more beauty and so on. It doesn't. I don't see why it follows that will even correlate necessarily be equal to thermodynamic free energy in the future. Like if I told you here's a world that's more beautiful, but it has less free energy or something, would you be like, I would rather have the one with more free energy and less beauty and creativity?
That's the
You know what
wrong
I
thing to
mean?
optimize for.
Yeah, I don't understand why that would be prima facie the thing you're trying to maximize.
Hmm.
Like, what if it was like totally unconscious? Was it literally just like optimizing for the maximum sort of entropy of the universe, but it wasn't actually in any way something recognizable to us as something that could be beautiful or something that could be experience different sort of great feelings or something.
Well, then there's back in the debate about like, is an unconscious entropy maximizer, paperclip maximizer type thing even possible? Like, are p zombies possible? Like, is it possible for something to have goals and the intelligence to pursue them, but no kind of self-reflection or consciousness.
First of all, it just could be the case. It could be true. I mean, we don't know one way or another. But it's true, even among humans, that there have been these pathological ideologies that have pursued these single-minded aims that have resulted in terrible harms, and communism, Nazism, whatever. So, if that's possible with humans, I don't know why you'd assume that's not possible with AIs.
Well, because communists and Nazis are still conscious. Is it
Yeah,
possible?
I mean, in terms of like, even if they are conscious, them trying to pursue their ideology to its ends or their value system to its ends just results in a shit ton of mayhem and destruction.
Yeah, I suppose. Speaking of which, why do you think like Marxism has been so persistent of an ideology, even after like it's like Marx made a lot of specific predictions, even that were specifically falsified, like the US would, soon become communist, and that just didn't happen.
Yeah. Um, I'm certainly not an expert in this. I just interviewed Hyung Chang, who wrote a book about the growing up to the Cultural Revolution in China, and it's going to come out next week. But she was talking about, she wrote a biography of Mao that was not well received amongst academia because it was really harsh on Mao. And she was talking about, I asked her, why is there sort of this instinctual desire in parts of the academia to defend these brutal communist dictators like in Venezuela or Cuba or Russia? As for why there's Marxism, I think part of it is just that it aligns with certain aspects of human psychology of making classes of people, exploiters, exploited, and so on, and having a overarching theory of history, of having a narrative and a sense of struggle. But I remain confused as to why it's not been completely discredited and people still ascribe to it.
Well, techno-optimism also has like a, grand narrative and plays to human psychology, the monomyth, the hero's journey, humanity descended or ascended from our position as like
Yeah.
mere apes in the savannah to like building the sand god.
Yeah.
I think the sand god phrasing is a little cringe, but you get the point. So why
Yeah.
hasn't techno-optimism supplanted Marxism? Is it just the inertia
Well,
of
you have like
institutions?
competing ideologies. It certainly is succeeding in some sense, right? Or has adherence. Uh, Part of it is just like there's not enough people yet who have enough context to understand techno-optimism, whereas anybody can understand Marxism, or not anybody, but you can kind of understand the sort of thinking behind Marxism. Yeah, and then I don't think they necessarily supplant each other, more as they'll just be in competition with each other, or they have been in competition with each other. Like a bunch of narratives are in competition with each other. As for how one should personally be in relevance in relation to these narratives, Tyler Cowen has a great talk where he says that as soon as you adopt a story, you're basically pushing a button that decreases your IQ by 15 points. You got to take things case by case and understand the specifics of situations instead of having some 5,000 year grand narrative that explains everything.
Yeah, that reminds me of something else Brian Kaplan said on your podcast where he was like, you're talking about feminism, and he was like, "Oh, when I write books about it, I try not to argue like a lawyer, and
Mm.
begin with my preconceived conclusion and then make arguments for it, no
Right.
matter what."
Yeah, and just probably to a certain extent he does that because we all are forced to do it. The great thing about society is that then we just rebut each other and we're left with a um, better outcome in the end. Um, yeah.
So you like to talk about like youth and talent. So
Hmm.
if you could rule the world and you could reallocate the amount of smart, talented kids entering the workforce however you wanted, like what areas would you take them out of and what areas would you put them into?
I actually did ask this to Grant Anderson. Maybe, I don't know if you listened to that one.
Yeah.
Um, this might be a sort of overreaching take. I certainly think like really smart people being in non-STEM subjects. There certainly should be some people doing non-STEM things. Um, Would I want to take him out of it though? Because then you just be left with even worse non-STEM things. Because then you actually have to reduce the relevance of non-STEM things into everyday society. Oh, I would say this. The obvious one is you really want smarter people in politics. Here's an interesting observation. So when so often when I'm reading an interesting paper or reading an interesting article or something, and I look up the author, the guy turns out to be a central banker. He's like the former president of the New York Federal Reserve or something. And so we have a great system actually for finding and identifying really professional, competent, nonpartisan people to be central bankers. And I would just like that kind of system for different kinds of government offices. Like if the U.S. president was as smart as the prime minister of Singapore or something, or the ministers in the cabinet were as smart as that. Obviously, the political life we should definitely have more talent in. But I don't think it's like talented people aren't going into politics so much as the selection pressure doesn't favor them.
So what do you think the secret is for central bankers then?
I think there's literally a whole like a centuries long sort of filtration process. Maybe not centuries long, but decades long. That institutions that have been built up that like you learn that we find the most competent people in high school. We send them to these elite colleges. And econ, at least until recently, is not like a politically contaminated discipline. It's like a super rigorous discipline where we care about the truth. And then we find the most competent people who have been through the undergrad there, and we send them to grad school. We find the most competent people there, and then we have them do be like shadow the people who are most competent. And this is the same thing with law schools. And I think that's why the Supreme Court, for example, it's like I think they do a good job of actually trying to understand and parse the law, because we have the system that like selects for people. You know what I mean? We have these institutions that cultivate talent in this way.
So it's just like relentless competence and talent filters.
Yeah.
There's no additional traits that you would like specifically select for a central banker aside from just, intelligence and hardworkingness and competence.
And caring about the subject, like being a non-political person, not
Integrity,
being like a
I imagine.
non-activist type. What was it you just said?
Integrity, I imagine.
Yeah.
You would
Um, but it's not even just like you can be high integrity and also be a very political type of person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Just like a non-partisan, politically ambivalent types.
You wouldn't want Sam Bankman-Fried running the central bank, though, I imagine.
No. Yeah. And so then, yeah, it's interesting to specify what is it about him, because he's obviously smart, he's obviously hardworking. Maybe dysregulated people, not dis as in not being regulated by the government, but as in personally not being well regulated. That
Well,
seems like a bad sign.
are you talking about Sam Bankman-Fried?
Yeah.
Really? Because he strikes me as very well regulated personally, but just kind of, misaligned. He's not unaligned, he's misaligned. Like instead of focusing on, oh, what should I be doing that's legal? What should I be doing that will benefit my shareholders the most? He thinks about what should I do that will benefit my lofty goals of effective altruism the most. I
I
remember,
honestly don't think that's actually the best explanation of his
really,
behavior. I think it genuinely is he like a level of incompetence at certain things, using like QuickBooks or making these ridiculous bets that even in expected value terms probably didn't make sense at the time he was making them. You just like being hopped up on a bunch of amphetamines and making these back of the envelope $1 billion decisions. I don't think that's well regulated personal behavior. And it just like evidenced, and maybe this is better evidence for the old school theories that people tend to have, like, hey, if you get a haircut and you kind of act like a normal person and dress up in a suit, like I'll trust you. I think like SBF is good evidence of that. Like the kind of guy who's just hopped up, playing StarCraft while he's talking to you. I guess you could say if there's no first principles reason you should disqualify somebody for that, but this is a good evidence of like, oh, that kind of person is just kind of all over the place.
I think famously he was like remarkably bad at League of
Yeah.
Legends. Like he never made it
Yeah.
past like bronze or silver or something after years of playing
Right.
it for hours a day.
Yeah. But he was playing it for hours a day while he was in meetings and shit.
So then if the explanation is not that he was malicious, but just that he was incompetent, how did he get such success in the first place?
This is something I have learned by watching a bunch of very successful people, is that you would be surprised the extent to which there are successful people in certain domains who lack judgment and can make big mistakes in pretty seemingly relevant domains. And so you should always double check people's judgment, even they're in high positions of credibility. Um, Everything from like your judgment of how things will progress, epistemic judgments, to these sorts of tactical executive judgments. I mean, there's been a bunch of details that came out about what's been going on with Alameda and FTX, but the sort of bets they were making of doubling down on these shit coins and so on, it certainly doesn't seem like the lying was obviously the low integrity move, but those bad bets themselves were just evidence of like fucking it up, right?
Yeah. I remember reading somewhere in one of the like teardowns of what actually happened that like, Sam Bankman-Fried famously made his first $20 million from arbitraging Bitcoin, and then it was gone within like a year because he made a
Yep.
bunch of really bad bets. So I guess if
Yeah,
you
and
if
he just
you
like lost a shit ton of like AWS and things like that, right?
yeah. So I guess like if you make lots of like very kind of seemingly stupid like high variance bets on like illiquid inefficient markets like crypto in the early 2010s, like one of them might pay off well. But still parlaying like $20 million success into like a $20 billion success even temporarily is like, that's no small feat.
Oh, certainly. He's definitely a talented guy. But that just goes to show you that talented people can have bad judgment and be incompetent at um even at their own fields. I have less of a sort of mindset now of this guy's unilaterally a super achiever, this guy's unilaterally has bad judgment.
Do you think you would have in a million years predicted that FTX would just blow up like this
For
or be
now, to be
fraudulent?
honest. No, honestly. Yeah, and I interviewed him before, and I sort of did
Yeah.
like a lot of research on him and his company before, and I would not have.
Do you think that there are any companies today that you look at and think of like, wow, this might be like another FTX situation?
Yeah, like there's a lot of companies in AI where you think, what valuation are you raising at, and why will you not just be automated at the next OpenAI Dev Day? Um, I don't know if it's like FTX level though,
Well, yeah,
and I don't know if it's
grifters are
like blatant
everywhere.
fraud.
Grifters are everywhere, but like, specifically on the level of FTX because
Yeah,
FTX was just
it's hard to
colossal. It was
see.
like top. Yeah.
I think crypto is like especially liable to fraud, obviously, because you are just moving numbers around rather than um so it becomes easier there. I mean, I do think there will be like we saw stuff with EMOD and stability. I don't know if you saw all those revelations.
Yeah, I've seen them.
Yeah, so stuff like that. I don't know. I think a lot of stuff that will come up in AI, but it'll just be so overwhelmed by the good investments that are made in AI that will be like $1 trillion companies or something.
Yeah. With FTX, I was watching the Nas Daily like short-ish video on him before
Yeah.
the collapse. And he was like, "Oh, this guy is a billionaire and he's vegan and he wants to donate all of his money to effectiveness and he does crypto." And I was thinking like, obviously, I'm not going to say like, "Oh, I predicted this." I knew what was going to happen with FTX beforehand. But something there struck me as a little sus, a little not normal for billionaires.
Yeah.
So the
But
ones
I
that
think it's also the case that you could say this about a lot of people. If there's always there's always evidence that retrospectively paints them in like, oh, I should have for that was very sus. I should have seen it coming. But like you could tell a similar story about literally every single billionaire. There's things out there, rumors that afterwards you could be like, oh, obviously that guy was a fraud.
Hmm. So another question on talent. What is it that makes people stand out even among like extremely talented, extremely smart, extremely productive people like Elon Musk? So, Elon Musk just stands out just totally in a class by himself, even among like billionaires. So why is that? What's
Yeah.
different about Elon?
Um, what I've heard from people who have uh who are like worked with him or are in lesser degrees of separation is just a complete willfulness of the John Wick quote of he'll just I don't remember the exact quote, but it was like he'll like just get what he wants. He'll scream, he'll throw tantrums, he'll stay up 24 hours a day, he'll do whatever it takes, but it is happening if he wants it to happen. He'll fucking fire everybody and restart the whole project. Um, but a level of focus on progress and lack of complacency.
Is that it? Like, is that all it takes? And if that is all it takes, then why hasn't anyone else reached his level?
Um, I mean, how many people do you know who all that could apply to?
None in real life.
Yeah,
Like, it's very
I
rare, of course.
I
But
mean,
is it
I know a lot of people who I've gotten to meet a lot of people in the last few years, and I'm trying to think, do I know somebody who's that willful? Maybe, but I
just
think it's like
high
a rare
agency
trait.
people?
Yeah, and even agency doesn't do the word justice. You know what I mean?
Really? It's more than
It,
that?
yeah, it's not just because when people mean by agency nowadays, it's been so diluted. Of it just means like, oh, you're willing to send a cold email, like congratulations or something. But this is like, no, literally, I'll go fly to fucking Russia and we're going to buy the old ballistic missiles. I don't know. It's just like a level of this is happening no matter what. It's not just that I will come up with different ideas, but I will make it happen no matter what. It's like calling the ocean wet. That's like what calling Elon high agency is.
Hmm. Have you read the Walter Isaacson biography?
No, have you?
Yeah.
Yeah, you might know more about this than me then actually. What do you think? What makes him special?
Well, I think one of the best takeaways was not even in the Walter Isaacson bio. It was in a Scott Alexander article,
Yeah.
Slate, Slate's Astro Codex 10. And
Yeah.
it wasn't about the Walter Isaacson book, it was about the Ashley Vance book. But he said something like, very similar. Elon is like a 1 in 10,000 or like 1 in 1,000 level of good engineer and intelligent and all that. But obviously, like that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for
Right.
the success that he's had. But what really sets him apart is that he's like 1 in 1,000,000 driven. Like he will do all this stuff. He'll go to Russia and he'll stay up 24 hours a day and work 120-hour weeks and take on projects that people would think would be completely insane and then make them work. Um,
Right.
but it just seems like something's missing. Like, how is it that only Elon is Elon? Why,
Right.
why, why is there only one Elon and not 100 Elons?
Um, I think there are like a lot of startup founders who are very driven and I don't think like Elon's necessarily the only person who's that driven. It just even if they were all equally driven, they wouldn't necessarily all achieve the equal outcomes. And their outcomes would be distributed along a power law, right? And so maybe you would see the exact same pattern we in fact do see.
Could it be like ambition and complacency? Like, not everyone at the age of 50 worth, 11 figures is going to
Try to get a 12
continue being
figure.
in the office 80 or 100 hours a week working on
Yeah.
some of the hardest stuff. Like
Yeah,
Bezos isn't
that's right.
anymore.
Yeah, that's probably part of it, right? Like you could have how many Elons are there that just retired after SpaceX and took home the $100 million?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then
probably a
like,
lot.
do you think Elon is like incredibly, incredibly smart? I don't know how well you know him or know of him personally, but like
No, I
how
don't.
much I wonder how
Um,
much just raw intelligence factors into his success.
there's a big debate about this, right? Of is extremely high IQ necessary for something like that, and do these people in fact themselves have extremely high IQs?
Warren
I
Buffett
think
famously says no.
um
Warren Buffett famously says no.
yeah, it just he says after 130 you might as well just give up those points and work on emotional IQ. But I think that's like that's bullshit. 130, definitely, that's just like two standard deviations. That's like 5% of the population. That's a huge amount of people, right? Even among them, you can definitely filter by IQ. And there's been these studies that show that the gains from IQ don't actually diminish. You can just keep going out the curve, and you'll still keep seeing gains in salaries or whatever. So yeah, I think they're really smart. It's just the case that if you're selecting some bunch of like 100 different traits, you're not going to get a top score in any one of them because it's a multi. The guy who has the highest IQ probably doesn't also have all these other traits which are necessary.
So we've been talking about all these talent questions. How relevant actually are they in a world where we seem to be rapidly approaching AGI?
I think they definitely are relevant to obviously to like the AI question itself, right? Like you definitely want to recruit people who are going to be working on this who are, what, in fact, what might be more relevant than ever, because if you look at past periods in history where there's been huge as the AI stuff starts to take off, you're going to need like politicians and policymakers and hardware makers and diplomats, and the world's going to look crazy, right? If this stuff pans out. And so it's going to be thousands of people at the very least who are managing this whole thing as it goes down. And to now be plucking out the people who would be talented at these different kinds of roles, and not only managing the research itself, but the huge amounts of variables that are going to be latent when you have $50 billion training runs and fucking countries potentially going to war over with AI weapons and shit. Maybe it might be more relevant than ever to be picking the talent to manage that, and just have generally competent people in society so that when it happens, they can kind of deal with it well.
So talking about good policymakers, this reminds me also of what you were talking about in one of your Tyler Cowen episodes where you were like, oh, actually, or Tyler said, actually, state capacity might not be in decline and it might be stronger than it previously was. Do you think that's true?
I just had Dominic Cummings on, and if you've seen it, you know that his take is very much that state capacity is very much in decline. I don't know. I think like certainly in many parts of maybe that was just a description of the UK itself. It feels like with COVID we saw but the system was like very brain dead in many important ways. Maybe it was even worse before, right? So it could just be that it was worse before and actually things are improving. Yeah, I don't really know.
More the US. The US and the UK have always been different, I think.
Yeah.
Like, the anecdote where Lee Kuan Yew went to the UK and he noticed everyone there was like orderly waiting in the queue. And he was like, wow, I need to bring this orderliness and respect for rules to Singapore. And then he did. And now Britain is, less orderly than it was.
Right. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, to some extent, I think maybe the problems he's talking about are unique to this UK, but I think a lot of them are general. Just the huge bureaucracies that are insulated from executive control and from any system to prune away incompetence. Maybe there's like different levels. There's certain aspects of the system that do seem to be really competent. Like I actually do have like a lot of confidence in the Federal Reserve or the Supreme Court or something. The FDA, the CDC, those kinds of institutions actually did seem to function really badly during the pandemic. But then there are other aspects of the system that actually do function really well that are kind of linked to the government itself, a bunch of think tanks and so on. I don't know how it nets out actually.
So you mentioned the Supreme Court and the Federal Reserve as like two examples of institutions that do function well. I mean, like I remember the Federal Reserve in particular, the last couple of years with inflation has just gotten so much shit from all kinds of people for like not having enough data, not reacting quickly enough. Like, do you think the Federal Reserve is still like even relevant? when we have so much data and so much compute? And or was it ever relevant?
I mean, it's certainly relevant in that they set the monetary policy. I
Necessary, not relevant.
Yeah, because I mean, if you're going to have a dollar currency, you need uh obviously it matters. And Sorry, is it necessary? Yeah, if you're going to have dollar denominated currencies, then the policy of managing dollars is going to matter and is necessary. You could say, well, with crypto or something, you could maybe not have that. Maybe, I don't know. It would be the actual stable cryptos have been the stable coins, which are obviously dollar denominated and then liable to move around with the Federal Reserve's decisions.
What do you think are some other examples of institutions that work really well within the US government?
The Rand Corporation, which is not obviously officially linked to the government, but is, I think we actually have been focusing a lot of efforts on the AI and biorisk kinds of things, and they seem super competent and well versed there. Um, I guess you're asking like in national government institutions, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that much about them actually. Those are the only ones that come to my head immediately.
Do you have any ideas based on talking to Dominic Cummings or based on reading Robert Caro about how to fix Congress? Like the single most shat on institution in the country, probably.
I think just regular stuff of having higher IQ people in there, like paying them more. Um, Garrett Jones in 10% Less Democracy has these ideas about. It does seem like senators. Here's something that's really interesting. Um, the senators who are best are actually from these like random states, like Montana or Nebraska or something, and they're just like these really smart people. And then the ones who are worse are from these really big states, and also generally senators just seem to be a lot smarter than congressmen on average, and that probably has in part to do with they're more insulated from day-to-day democratic whims. So maybe having like longer terms for senators and congressmen. Um, yeah, so I would do that. Like House is elected every 4 years instead of every two.
That kind of flies in the face of what, your average American would say if you ask them, how do we fix Congress? They're like, cut their pay and impose term limits.
Yeah. Um, Term limits might be warranted. It just like, but actually maybe not because like on one hand there's a gerontocracy, on the other hand there is such a thing as expertise that you're building up over time as you're in the institution. Um, but yeah, I think that I think the average person would be wrong, and many such cases.
So you talked about how we need to get higher IQ people in Congress, and that seems to be no easy task. Like a recent-ish example would be Blake Masters, who ran in
Mhm.
Arizona. He was clearly smart. He went to Stanford. He co-wrote Peter Thiel's book. He was endorsed and funded by Peter Thiel. He had ideas that were out of the mainstream, which is some signal of intelligence. He didn't just get everything from the Republican Party platform, and he still lost in a like state that was previously relatively Republican. So like how do you reconcile getting smart people in office with just like the whims of voters that might not be optimizing for that?
I think it's unfair to blame voters on that one in particular. I don't follow the politics that much. I don't know the particulars of that campaign, but it wasn't just that he was advertising himself as a competent guy who's gonna go to Washington. It did seem like he just played a Faustian bargain there with Trumpism. Uh, that it's understandable why voters might have concerns about. Um, yeah, so but politics is not something I follow that closely, so I don't know the particulars of that race or anything.
What about just in general? Like how actually do we get more high IQ people in Congress?
Pay them more. Uh, uh, Longer term limits, I think, is a big one. I think part of it is just like getting high IQ people to decide to go into politics. It's not just about the system which elects for them. It's also about what goes into a filter. But these seem like obvious things. So I don't know if I have anything new to say here. Yeah, like it's obvious that we should have smarter people try to go into Congress, and it's obvious that we should pay them more. Yeah, I don't know, but what do you think we should do?
Basically that. But like
Yeah,
in terms of actually getting smart people in Congress, I think a lot of smart people will kind of just follow where the money is because,
yeah,
they're smart and money is nice. And that leads them into CS. I mean, I like computers, but I like a lot of stuff. And I would be lying if I said that my reason for picking CS over all of them was not like largely motivated by money.
yeah.
Um, and AI. So, yeah, I mean, what Singapore did clearly just seemed to work really, really well. Um, but then again, there are other countries like Israel has been a quite successful country, quite successful post-colonial success story. And unlike Singapore, they did not have a super well functioning political system. Like if you know about Israeli politics, you know that it's been like falling apart the last few years. In order to
Yeah.
get a majority in government, parties need to form coalitions with like the Orthodox. And then, of course, for the first couple decades of Israel's existence, it was run by like the Socialist Labor Party.
Yeah.
So maybe it's not like absolutely necessary to have like super smart, well coordinated people running a government for stuff to work.
Well, Israel um did actually become much wealthier in since it adopted free market stuff
Yeah.
recently, right? So yeah,
Maybe
I think it's like
the,
GDP per capita actually like shot up a lot, right?
yeah. Maybe the solution is not, optimized for like the best people in government. Maybe it's just like take the government out of most stuff and most stuff will
Yeah.
work out.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a combination of both. Like a smaller government, but the part that it has to run, it's just run by very competent people. Which is kind of Singapore, basically.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So flipping the script a little bit, people like to start podcasts with like, how did you get into this and what's your favorite part? But I'll try ending the podcast with like, what's your favorite part of doing what you do? And like what specifically motivated you to do it? Was it just boredom?
Yeah, I was bored in college. I think I was literally in the same situation you were in. I was a sophomore in college studying computer science. Um, the best part is definitely I will never stop being grateful for the fact that I can talk to literally the smartest people in the world, the people talking about and thinking about the most interesting things, and just ask them questions for 2 hours or 3 hours at a time, and be funded to spend the rest of my time thinking about what to ask them, doing research, trying to figure out what's important, who to have on, and so on. That's a huge privilege. No, obviously, I'm super grateful for it, and that's my favorite part.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. So thank you so much, Dwarkesh Patel, for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure, man.
Thanks for listening to this episode with Dwarkesh Patel. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the Theo Jaffe podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at Theo Jaffe, and subscribe to my Substack at theojaffe.com. Also, be sure to check out Dwarkesh's Substack, dwarkeshpatel.com. Follow him on Twitter at Dwarkesh_SP, and of course, listen to the Dwarkesh Podcast, which you can find on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. All of these will be linked in the description. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next episode.